All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're so glad that you're here with us this evening. My name is Jennifer Miller. I'm a librarian in the Adult Services Department at the Scotch Plains Public Library in New Jersey. Our speaker this evening is Professor Rafe Blaufarb. Dr. Blaufarb teaches in the History Department at Florida State University, where he directs the Institute on Napoleon and the French Revolution. His many publications include Napoleon, A Symbol for an Age, Napoleonic Foot Soldiers and Civilians, and the award-winning book, The Great Demarcation, The French Revolution and the Invention of Modern Property. So I'm very pleased to welcome him, and we will let him get started.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Good evening, everybody. As Jennifer mentioned, I teach at Florida State University. I direct the Institute on Napoleon and the French Revolution, and I just want to mention that if any of you are interested in pursuing graduate education, that is master's or PhD, in this general area of French Revolutionary or Napoleonic history, or if you know anyone who is interested in that, I would be very happy to speak with you about the program. You can get my information on the FSU, the Florida State University History Department website. Well, today we're going to talk about, or tonight I should say, we're going to talk about Napoleon. Now, as you all know, there's this Ridley Scott movie that has just come out recently. I am not going to spoil that movie for those of you who are planning on seeing it, because I'm going to talk about tonight what happened before the movie starts. The movie begins in December 1793, when Napoleon is already an artillery officer in the French Revolutionary Army. And as the movie opens, he's just about to embark upon the military adventure that's going to make his reputation, that's going to catapult him into the French national spotlight. But everything that happens before that point, everything that happens before Napoleon is a 24-year-old artillery captain poised for greatness, the movie has nothing at all to say about. So today, we're going to talk about the young Napoleon, Napoleon's youth and early adulthood. So let me get started with the PowerPoint. And let's see. Okay. So we are going to be talking about Napoleon from his birth in 1769 until December 1793, when the movie opens. Well, the first thing to know about Napoleon is that he was not French. At least he was not born in mainland France. He was born in Corsica, and as you can see, Corsica is this little island. It's actually closer to Italy than France. And the people in Corsica are, I guess you would say, they're ethnically and culturally Italian. They speak Corsican, which is a dialect of Italian, and in many ways they're Italian rather than French. Here's what the island looks like. As you can see, it's quite mountainous. And I've marked out the location of Ajaccio. This is the city where Napoleon is born. This is the city where the Bonaparte clan is based. Well, when Napoleon is born in 1769, Corsica has just become French. It had been conquered by French armies only the year before. What had been going on before then? Why is there a French army conquering Corsica? What had been its condition before the French conquest? Well, Corsica historically had been a colony. It had been a colony of the Italian city-state of Genoa. That's a nearby Italian city on the coast of Italy. The Genoese had owned Corsica, but had exercised only very, very loose control of it. Really, all they had were a series of fortifications and tax collecting offices scattered along the coast of the island. But the bulk of Corsica, the entire inland area, was completely out of reach of the Genoese. Really, the Genoese they had little control over the place, and they had really exercised their control with a very light hand. They were barely present at all in the lives of most Corsicans. But even that slight Genoese presence was too much for the independence-loving Corsicans. And in the middle of the 18th century, this fellow, Pasquale Paoli, or in French, Pascal Paoli, had led his fellow Corsicans in revolt against the Genoese, and had succeeded in kicking them out and in making Corsica independent. So in the years before Napoleon's birth, Corsica is an independent country under the leadership of this man, Paoli, and the Corsicans had just thrown off the Genoese yoke, light as it was. Well, the Genoese, they realized they couldn't ever reconquer the island. They had barely controlled it to begin with. But what they did have, the Genoese, was they had legal rights under international law to the island of Corsica. And so the Genoese decide to make the best out of a bad situation and decide to sell their rights to the island, to sell their sovereignty over the island to the King of France. Now, France is a much, much larger country than Corsica. In fact, in the 1760s, when the French are going to send their expeditionary force to the island, there are approximately 100 French people for every Corsican. So the French dramatically outnumber the Corsicans. They are rich, they are powerful, and the King of France, Louis XV, wastes little time in deciding to make good his claim to the island. He sends an expeditionary force to Corsica. The Corsican patriots, under the leadership of Paoli, they fight valiantly against the French. They fight a number of battles, but in the end, there's no way that tiny Corsica can hold off the mighty armies of France. And so the Corsicans are forced to accept the French domination. Pascal Paoli himself never accepts this, and he instead of bowing down to the French, he goes off. He takes himself off to London in England in exile, refusing to acknowledge what has happened. However, most Corsicans, including Napoleon's parents, decide that to make peace with their new French masters. Here's Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte. His name will be Frenchified later on as Charles Bonaparte. Carlo Bonaparte had actually been a loyal lieutenant of Paoli. Carlo had fought alongside Paoli in all of the battles against the French. He had been a Corsican patriot, but when the French win the war, Carlo realizes, you know what? There's no point in sticking with this lost cause. The French are here to stay. They're our new masters. I may as well try to make the best of the situation. Carlo Bonaparte, after all, was the head of not just his little nuclear family, but an entire Bonaparte clan. And in fact, Carlo was one of the most powerful men in the city of Ajaccio. And his responsibility, he felt, was to advance the interests of his clan, of his family, of his retainers, of the people around him. And that meant making peace with the French and essentially trying to get advancement and riches from the French. And that's what Carlo is going to do. He, together with his wife, Letitia Bonaparte, Napoleon's mother, are going to approach the French military governor and offer their loyalty to France. They actually become friends with the military governor. They socialize together. In fact, well, it's not really a fact, but rumor has it that Letitia Bonaparte even has an affair with the French military governor. Not sure that's true, but be that as it may, the Bonapartes they successfully transform themselves into loyal subjects of the King of France and valuable auxiliaries to the new French government in the island. As I mentioned, the Bonaparte clan is an important family in Ajaccio. They influence that southern region of Corsica. The Bonapartes are not nobodies. I know that there's a myth of Napoleon as someone who was a commoner, a plebeian, who lifted himself up completely by his own bootstraps, came from nothing and rose to greatness purely on his own merits. Well, he certainly had merit and he certainly rose to greatness, but within the Corsican context, he came from a very important local family. In fact, the Bonapartes claim nobility. They claim hereditary noble privileged status. And because Letitia and Carlo are so good at switching sides and getting in good with the French governor, their noble status is confirmed. The Bonapartes claim descent from a long line of Florentine nobles, that is Florence in mainland Italy, and their claim to multiple generations of illustrious Florentine noble status is confirmed by the new French authorities. So the Bonapartes are going to become recognized French nobles. As a reward for Carlo and Letitia's loyalty and offers of service, the French government on the island of Corsica is going to give the family a whole bunch of favors, recognizing their nobility as one. Another one is that Carlo, the head of the family, is given a position in the local administrative assembly that the French set up for the island. But the benefits of loyalty to France are going to extend all the way down to the Bonaparte children. Now, the Bonapartes, Carlo and Letitia, are going to have a whole bunch of kids. All in all, they're going to have 5 sons and I believe, yes, 5 sons and 4 daughters. Well, no, sorry, 4. Sorry about this. It's hard to keep track of all this. 5 sons and 3 daughters. Napoleon is the second born son. He's not the eldest. Ordinarily, the eldest son in a noble family like the Bonapartes would be destined for a military career. But instead, Carlo and Letitia are going to reverse the roles and give the second born son Napoleon that profession. Why is that? Well, the eldest son Joseph ends up being a rather gentle, mild-mannered, friendly, socially adept, kind of wanting to, how should I put it? He doesn't want to fight people. He doesn't like crossing people. He's a conciliator. He's a politician. He's gentle. And he doesn't really seem cut out for a military career. Whereas his younger brother, Napoleon, is everything you would want in a military officer. He's forceful. He's domineering. In fact, he bosses around Joseph, his older brother. And in the traditional Corsican society that these people grow up in, that's not the way things are supposed to work. The eldest brother is supposed to be in charge. But in this case, Joseph is more than happy to let Napoleon have the leading role. And to their credit, Carlo and Letitia make the necessary adjustments. What they do is they decide to accept a free place at a French military boarding school that has been offered to them by the governor of the island. They decide to give that place to Napoleon rather than Joseph. Joseph, for his part, will be given a place at another elite prep school in France that specializes in training priests. Joseph is going to be the priest. He's sent off to a school oriented in that direction, whereas Napoleon is going to be given a free place at a military boarding school in France, thanks to the Bonapartes' newfound French loyalty, and is going to train to become a military officer. Napoleon goes off to military school at the age of 8 years old. He's really quite young. On top of that, he barely speaks French. In fact, when he first sets foot in France, he doesn't speak any French at all and has to be given several months of crash courses in order to even get like a basic understanding of the language. But still, when he shows up at the military school, and this is a fictional picture of what it must have been like for the young Napoleon. When he shows up at the military school, he barely speaks French at all. His classmates tease him about his accent. They tease him about his name. His name at the time is Napoleone Bonaparte, and his classmates find that his first name Napoleone, it sounds like paillonné, which means in French straw up your nose, and that's what they call him. They call him paillonné. They tease him. They bully him. Napoleon, though, doesn't really, how should I put it? You know, some kids, when they're bullied, they'll try to get in with their bulliers. They'll try to kiss up to their bulliers, become subservient, etc. Napoleon refuses to sink to that level. He's being bullied, but he remains fiercely independent. He's full of pride, and he just ignores the bulliers. But that means he's a loner. Napoleon is a lonely kid during his first years at military school. He's an outcast, but he sucks it up and refuses to compromise his pride and independence. He spends most of his time alone in reading books or just wandering the courtyard of the school. That's outside of class. In class, however, Napoleon turns out to be really quite gifted. He's an intelligent young man. He's very, very good at every subject he takes. His favorite subject, yay, is history. He loves history. We have some history notes that he took from his days at the military school. It's very interesting for historians to look at them, because in them he writes to himself a little fantasy about how when he graduates from the military school and becomes an adult, he's going to go off and unite with Paoli. Remember the Corsican George Washington, who's now in exile in England. Well, Napoleon is dreaming and fantasizing in his notes about going off and joining Paoli and becoming a kind of Lafayette to Paoli's Washington. And together the two will go back to Corsica and liberate it from the French tyrants, the French overlords who have conquered Napoleon's beloved homeland. That's like the paradox. Here is Napoleon, a scholarship student at an elite French military school, paid for by the King of France, being trained to become an officer in the French king's army, but secretly in his own mind, he's fantasizing about breaking free from France, about freeing his true homeland of Corsica. Napoleon, as a youth, feels Corsican. He does not feel French at all, which is quite interesting because at some point, as we all know, that's going to change, and he's going to become not just a revolutionary general, but ultimately emperor of France itself. Well, anyway, he's excellent at history, but the French military authorities don't care much for historians. The French army doesn't really need historians. What it needs is mathematicians. Why? Because back in the 18th century, to be a good artillery officer, you needed to have mastered calculus. At the time, calculus is a real cutting edge mathematical science. It had only been invented about 100 years earlier by Isaac Newton. So to find a military school kid who's good enough at math to master calculus, that's something that the school authorities have their eyes out for. When they realize that Napoleon is super talented at math, they decide to slot him into the artillery. Most of his fellow classmates, they're ordinary kids. They're all nobles, but they don't necessarily have a lot of brain power. They're all going into the infantry, where you don't really need any specialized skills. But Napoleon, with his math talent, is going to go into the artillery, where you really do need some brain power and some abilities. So after finishing up his preliminary schooling at this military school, Napoleon is going to be sent on to a specialized artillery school, a school like a finishing school for artillery officers, where he will really learn to be good at that trade. He ends up graduating from the military school, from the artillery school, the specialized school, at the age of 16. This is very typical in the French army. You enter the officer corps at the age of 16. That's very normal. He graduates at 16 from artillery school and is commissioned as a second lieutenant. So from the age of 8 through the age of 16, Napoleon has been in military school in France. He's had almost no contact with Corsica during this time. It must have been very lonely for him. But nonetheless, he does get adjusted. He learns France, and he puts on the king's uniform and goes off in the year 1785, a newly commissioned second lieutenant, to join his artillery regiment. From 1785 to 1789, the year that the French Revolution is going to break out and change everything, Napoleon is going to spend his time in various garrison towns, in garrison with his regiment. These are little towns, or rather, I should say small towns. They're not villages exactly, but they're not cities either. They're small towns on the eastern frontiers of France. And he's going to spend his time there, kind of bored. He's a diligent young officer, so he reads military manuals, he reads tactical manuals, he takes his job seriously, so he's preparing himself professionally, but he still has a lot of time on his hand. And what he's going to do is he's going to frequent what passes for high society in these little provincial towns. One of the things he does is he frequents an institution called salons. Salons they're essentially, they're almost like book clubs. They're like the book clubs of the age. They're usually run by well-to-do women, and these well-to-do women invite various people, also well-to-do noble or rich commoners, to come and discuss books together, or simply discuss ideas together. or simply be together, and share their love for, let's say, culture or enlightenment, because this is, after all, the age of enlightenment. Napoleon is going to take part in this world of the salon. Like many young officers in the 1780s in the French army, Napoleon's ideal is not just to be a soldier, not just to be a good artillery officer, but also to be a kind of refined, thinking, literate person. He wants to be what people called at the time a soldier philosopher. He'll be good at war, but he will also not neglect the finer things in life. He'll read philosophy, he'll go to plays, he'll read literature, he'll write poetry. He'll be kind of a jack of all trades between war and the literary life. And as a young man, Napoleon is actually going to compose. He's actually going to write a number of things. The most famous and surely the worst thing he writes is an essay, a rather long essay on the subject of how to be happy. You see, a learned academy in provincial France during this period proposes an essay contest on that subject. It basically says we're going to give a big cash prize to whoever writes the best essay on the question, what is the key to happiness? How can you be a happy person? Napoleon is going to throw himself into this, is going to write an essay on the subject, and it is really really an essay that's full of banalities, and it's just really awful. And in fact, the learned academy to which he submits it takes one look at it and puts it in a drawer. He doesn't win the prize. Why is this essay so bad? Well, Napoleon, this is Napoleon writing, he says that the key to happiness is to renounce ambition. He says that all of the ambitious people in the world, Alexander, Cromwell, whatever, they were all unhappy because of their unbridled ambition and love of conquest, and that the key is to renounce ambition, to be a modest person. Obviously, young Napoleon, who writes this, has really no idea of who he is himself as a person, because obviously, as we all know, the one thing Napoleon was ambitious. Nonetheless, he writes this essay. He tries to destroy it later on in life because it's so embarrassing. He actually says that whoever wrote this essay should be flogged. But his devious foreign minister Talleyrand has a copy made and saves it for posterity, so you can read what the young Napoleon was writing when he was thinking that maybe being a writer was the way he was going to go. Well, that's obviously not the way that he ends up going. In addition to hanging out in the garrison town, studying his craft and writing really bad essays, Napoleon also gets a little taste of actual military action. This is not going to be action in war, because France between 1785 and 1789 is not at war at all. It's at peace. But the army is going to be used on several occasions to put down internal unrest. And this is the military experience the young Napoleon is going to get. On 3 occasions, he is going to be actively involved. He and his men are going to be actively involved in putting down civil unrest. The first time is on his 17th birthday, where he puts down a movement of striking workers in the large textile city of Lyon. The second time is early in 1789, when he puts down a riot of peasants who are up in arms because they're afraid that they're gonna starve to death. It's a grain riot, a bread riot. And then finally, in the middle of 1789, he's going to put down an urban riot that is aiming at overthrowing the old aristocratic government of a nearby town. Because in this last instance, the French Revolution has already begun, and Napoleon is going to be involved in this minor way in its early stages in trying to put down an early instance of municipal revolution. But the revolution is going to really break out after that in 1789, and it's going to change Napoleon's destiny. What does Napoleon do when the French Revolution breaks out for real in the summer of 1789? Well, interestingly, the first thing he does is to go on leave. Napoleon, from 1789 until 1793, when the movie starts, during this 4-year period, or actually, should say it's a 5-year period, really the first 5 years of the French Revolution, Napoleon is barely going to be in France at all. He sees the French Revolution with its calls for liberty, its proclamation of liberty, the end of absolute monarchy. Napoleon interprets that call for liberty as meaning liberty for his real homeland, his real country, Corsica. And so what Napoleon does when the revolution breaks out is he begins requesting leave from his regiment, obtaining leave, requesting renewals of his leave, and ultimately, when he's ordered back to France by the War Ministry, going AWOL to remain in Corsica. What's he doing in Corsica? He gets involved in local Corsican politics. First of all, his idol Paoli, like Napoleon himself, returns to Corsica in 1789. Paoli believes that Corsica can have liberty within the framework of revolutionary France. His thinking, Paoli's thinking, and that of Napoleon too, is that since the French are going to be free as a whole, since they're no longer going to have an absolute monarch, since all government positions locally and nationally are going to be elected in free elections, Corsica can be free and still remain a part of France. And so that's what Paoli is going to do. He's going to try to organize local elections in Corsica and get his people elected. And that's what Napoleon is going to do too. Napoleon goes to Corsica, and his main goal is to try to get his older brother, Joseph, who's also come back to Corsica, elected to important local offices. And the way Napoleon is going to advance the interests of Joseph and the Bonaparte clan, the way he's going to advance their political interests, is by getting himself elected colonel of the local Ajaccio National Guard. That is the National Guard in the Bonaparte's fief of Ajaccio. The National Guard is kind of like the Minutemen during the American Revolution. They're a citizen militia, but they're formed not in the context of war like the Minutemen, but they're formed to be a kind of almost like a citizen police force. The National Guard is going to be there all the time in war or peace, and its main job is going to be maintaining local order in France itself and in Corsica, obviously, and also enforcing the law. So being colonel, commander, that is, of your local National Guard battalion, as Napoleon is very important, because he's kind of like a combination of the police force and the executive authority locally in Ajaccio. Well, the revolution in France is going to get more and more radical. In 1789, everything looks more or less happy, liberty, equality, fraternity. But by 1791, really quite a bit of violence is beginning to break out, and there are calls for a more radical form of revolutionary government. There are calls for a republic, a revolutionary republic, instead of what the French revolutionary authorities initially institute, which is a constitutional monarchy. As the French Revolution radicalizes in France, so too does it radicalize in Corsica. And the Corsicans themselves divide along similar lines to the French. On the one hand, there are Corsican moderates, and that faction is led by Paoli, by really the preeminent political figure of Corsica. But there's a more radical faction too, a radical Corsican faction that begins to side with the French Republicans, calling for an end to the monarchy and the institution of a new republican constitution. Napoleon himself is torn. On the one hand, he really, really admires Paoli. He wants to be close to Paoli. He loves Paoli. He feels almost like a son to Paoli. Paoli doesn't reciprocate those feelings, by the way. He doesn't have anything like the same regard for Napoleon as Napoleon has for him. So on the one hand, Napoleon wants to follow Paoli, remain with the moderate constitutional monarchist faction. But on the other hand, the Bonaparte clan as a whole is tilting more and more toward the pro-French, pro-radical Republican faction. And that is because Napoleon's younger brother, and here he is, Lucien Bonaparte, Napoleon's younger brother, Lucien Bonaparte, has gone off during the revolution to Paris itself, and he has gotten deeply involved in radical revolutionary politics. He has joined the Radical Jacobin Club. This is the political club that is really sort of way out in front of politics in the French Revolution. It is leading, and the revolutionary politicians are following. It is much more radical than the general political climate, and it kind of pulls France along in a radical direction. Well, Lucien is actively involved in this club, and in this club, he makes friends with another radical, a fellow by the name of Augustin Robespierre. Now, you may have heard of the name Robespierre. Maximilien Robespierre, another French Jacobin and revolutionary politician, will of course become the head of the Committee of Public Safety in 1793, and will be the names most associated with the guillotine and the Reign of Terror, the radical phase of the revolution. Well, Augustin Robespierre is Maximilien Robespierre's brother. Lucien Bonaparte is Napoleon's brother. So, to put it another way, Napoleon's brother and Robespierre's brother become very, very close. And Lucien Bonaparte gets very involved in the radical politics of the Jacobin Revolution, to the point that in France generally, the name Bonaparte becomes associated with the most radical political tendencies of the French Revolution. The Bonapartes, as a clan, are come to be associated, rightly or wrongly, with Robespierreism, with the Robespierrist faction, and ultimately with the guillotine and the Reign of Terror. Well, because the Bonaparte name is getting increasingly associated with revolutionary radicalism, the Corsican moderates, led by Paoli, become increasingly hostile toward the Bonaparte clan and come to see them, pretty much by early 1793. Paoli and his supporters come to see the Bonapartes as radicals and as traitors to Corsica. By this point, by 1793, with the radicalization of the revolution in France, Paoli has come to conclude that Corsica can't actually be free anymore in the French orbit, because revolutionary France is going off the rails. That the guillotine, that terror, that the republic, this is not what freedom looks like. And Paoli is getting ready to make a break with France, to invite in the English, who are at war with France by this point, and to declare a kind of independence for Corsica under English protection. But what that means, what Paoli's strategy means, is getting rid of, eliminating the pro-French Corsican faction. And that means getting rid of the Bonapartes. Tensions between the Bonapartes and the Paoli faction grow through the early months of 1793. And finally, in June of 1793, violence breaks out. There's street fighting in the city of Ajaccio between the pro-Paoli forces and the Bonaparte forces. Napoleon, as commander of the Ajaccio National Guard, is involved. Shots are fired. People are killed. This is pure political fighting. But at the end of the day, the Bonapartes lose. They simply lose support. Their pro-French position is simply untenable, and they are forced to flee Corsica. Their property is ransacked, and they barely get out unscathed. In June of 1793, they have to take they basically get on a boat in the middle of the night and flee to the south of France. That's Napoleon and his mother and his entire family. They flee to the south of France in June of 1793. There they find an equally problematic situation. Much of provincial France, including important cities in the south of France like Marseille and Toulon, have revolted actually against the radical revolutionaries in Paris. They have these cities in the south of France have declared that Robespierre and his faction do not represent the true revolution. They do not represent the real interests of the French people, and they've effectively risen up in arms against the central authority in Paris. In response, the Parisian authorities have sent an army down to the south of France. When it drew near, the rebels in Marseille, they said, "Oh my God, there's a big army coming after us. We don't have a chance," and they simply surrendered to prevent bloodshed. However, the city of Toulon, and here's a map of it. It's a fortified port city. It's home to France's Mediterranean fleet. Then and now it still is. The city of Toulon, which had also risen up against the Paris Jacobins, instead of putting down its arms when the Republican armies of Paris approach, the people of Toulon summon the British forces. They summon the British Navy and Army to come into the city and to protect it, to garrison it and protect it from the retribution of the French revolutionary armies. And so when Napoleon and his family land in the south of France in 1793, what they find is the city of Toulon, this important French naval base, is in open revolt against France and is being protected from French retribution by an English army and an English fleet, which can resupply the city by sea at will. And that's where Napoleon is going to get his start. For reasons I don't have to go into, you can see it in the film because this is where the film picks up. Napoleon is going to be given a chance to try to take command of the French forces besieging the city of Toulon, and to try to break the English hold on the city. And in fact, that's what he's going to do in December 1793, and he is going to succeed brilliantly at liberating Toulon. And from that point on, he's going to go from one triumph to another. But the movie starts with Napoleon, a refugee from Corsica, having just arrived in the south of France and being given this extraordinary opportunity as an artillery officer to try to liberate Toulon. And so that's where I'm going to end my talk. I'm happy. I'd love to have questions if you have any. I'd be happy to field them.
Yeah, well, first let me say thank you so much. That was really fascinating. So many insights. I think, many of us probably had no idea about all these factors in Napoleon's background. So certainly if you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat or unmute yourself, however you'd like to do that. Be happy to hear from anybody.
I can just add one thing. It's, I had mentioned, I guess I didn't wrap this up. Napoleon, I said, had been a Corsican patriot, and he remained one up until 1793. And it's really only the fact that his family loses the factional struggle and has to flee Corsica that Napoleon finally, in his own mind, says, okay, I'm French now because I've been kicked out by the Corsicans. So let's see. Here's Rich Fortunato has a question. Had he met Josephine at this point? No, he meets Josephine about two years later or so. This is after he's already broken the English hold over Toulon, and it's after he has put down a major revolt in Paris against the revolutionary government, that Napoleon is going to be introduced to Josephine by Paul Barras, the most powerful man in France at that point. Actually, Josephine had been Barras' mistress right up until that point, but Barras had tired of Josephine and had kind of handed her off to Napoleon as a kind of reward for serving Barras well and putting down this revolt, that he meets Josephine. So Josephine's not in the picture yet. Napoleon's all alone. He's barely had a girlfriend. I don't even think he's almost a virgin at this point. He's a 24-year-old artillery officer. Really, Josephine is the first woman in his life, and it's still 2 years down the road. Let's see. Let me get Andrea's question later about the mistakes in the movie, but I see Walter has his hand up. So let me field your question, Walter, first.
Thanks, Dr. Blaufarb. So I had a question with the Napoleon always struck me as very pragmatic. Do you think that was because his passion was the Corsican cause with Paoli, and that break he kind of like stopped being like idealistic and more like, well, how do I just kind of go forward now and get successful?
Yeah, I mean, there might be something to it because that Corsican patriotism that he had, along with his idea that he's going to be a philosopher and all this stuff, it's very youthful, idealistic, and completely unrealistic. And so it might be the hardships of life. It might have been his real disappointment at being rejected by Paoli having to flee Corsica, having to fight for the interests of his family. I mean, they're basically refugees with nothing in France. All of that may have made him way more hard-headed, determined, and pragmatic. Because you're right, he is pragmatic. Napoleon he's not an ideologue at all. But he has certain ideals. One ideal that will stick with him for his whole life is family. Family comes first. One of his aims is always advancing the interests of his family. And when he becomes emperor later on, he makes all of his brothers and sisters kings and queens of the countries he conquers. I mean, that's family, right? I mean, so yeah, but I think probably life, the school of hard knocks, did something to ground him and make him pragmatic. That's a good insight on your part. Let's see. Now let me do the mistakes in the movie. Andrea's question. Look, the movie is a movie, and it's not a history textbook. So it had to cut a lot of things. I guess there just wasn't time for everything. Well, the movie does cut a lot of things. It cuts the majority of Napoleon's famous military campaigns aren't even mentioned in the movie. I mean, I guess that's not an inaccuracy. It's just simply, wow, they don't even happen. But the biggest inaccuracy, the one that's really the most Hollywood of them all, is in the casting. The actor who plays Napoleon in the movie I think must be in his mid-40s or something. In any event, he's about 15, the actor I'm talking about is about 15 years older than the actress who plays Josephine in the movie. In reality, Josephine was 6 years older than Napoleon. But because it's Hollywood, you can't show this. If you show a younger man with an older woman, that becomes the whole focus of the movie. And so you need a kind of, grumpy you need a middle-aged Napoleon with a very young, sexy Josephine if it's Hollywood, but it was really the other way around. Josephine was very much the older, more sophisticated, much more mature partner, at least initially in their relationship. But the movie does not show that at all. It's just the opposite. To me, that's the most glaring problem, because it's problematic. It's basically Hollywood sexism. Okay, Noah, do we have a solid sense of Joseph's personal politics during the radicalizing revolution and whether he aligned with Napoleon's views of Corsican independence? That's a good question. My sense is that Joseph was probably pretty moderate, kind of like Napoleon himself. It's really Lucien in Paris who's like dragging the Bonaparte family to the left, whether they like it or not. It's Lucien's activities in Paris, his close connection with the Robespierres, that makes it impossible for people like Joseph and Napoleon to go to Paoli and say, hey, Paoli, we're on your side, we're moderates, because this family member in Paris is doing something quite different and is reaping benefits as well by association with the radical Parisian power faction. That may not be a wonderful answer, but that's my sense. Joseph is a pretty moderate guy throughout his life. Oh, by the way, I was mentioning to Jennifer, after the Battle of Waterloo, Joseph has to flee France into exile, and he goes to New Jersey, where the library is. He actually spends the last several decades of his life in New Jersey, and is one of the leading citizens of the state in the 1820s and 30s.
We'll have to do a program on that sometime.
Are there any questions? Any other questions, I should say? I'm happy to field them.
I was wondering, since he he took he took leave from the French army early in his career to, try and work with Paoli. Did he have trouble getting back?
That's a really great question. Um, he's actually, I won't give you dates, but after being on leave for basically 3 years solid, um, some often once with a fake medical excuse, an extension, and then just being AWOL. He's finally, the war ministry is going to cashier him. They're going to kick him out of the army for being AWOL because he's not coming back to his regiment. And the only thing that saves Napoleon from being kicked out of the army is at that very moment when the paperwork dismissing him is about to be signed. There's a radical revolution in Paris. There's a massive uprising that overthrows the monarchy. Literally, thousands of Parisian radicals storm what is now the Louvre, the art museum. That was the royal palace. They storm it. The king and queen have to flee for their lives. The entire government is overthrown. All the ministries are ransacked, and the paper dismissing Napoleon from the army is lost in the shuffle. That's literally he owes much to the radical revolution. Napoleon really does. Okay, here's a question, a broad movie question. This is also from Noah. Were there aspects in the film that you felt accurately represented his personality? Yeah, one of the, I don't want to give too much away about the film, but one of the things you see repeatedly in the film is Napoleon's physical courage. Napoleon had no problem at any point in his military career mixing it up. He did not command from the rear. I mean, he could, but he was perfectly happy to get into the thick of battle, and he was wounded several times. The movie portrays his physical courage, and it also portrays kind of what was, I think, behind that physical courage. Napoleon really liked war and battle. He kind of can't resist a good battle. He can't resist a good war. He actually seems to enjoy it. And this is really his great weakness. He can't stop himself. He can't make himself make peace. He has to keep fighting and keep pushing on until he has conquered everything in his path. And the movie shows that aspect, that really bellicose, brave, but kind of out of control, bellicose aspect of Napoleon's personality really well. Napoleon loves power, and war and fighting is one of the most intense manifestations of power, and Napoleon can't resist it. There's a question: does his brother lose his head with Marat? Actually, none of the Bonapartes are going to be executed or guillotined at all. Napoleon, after the fall of Robespierre, after the fall of Maximilien Robespierre, the Committee of Public Safety, the Reign of Terror, Napoleon is actually going to be thrown in prison for several weeks on the charge that he was a terrorist. That's what they called people who supported the terror, that he supported the guillotine, that he supported the terror, and was in some danger of being executed, but ultimately they let him go. So somehow all of the Bonapartes escape, despite their connections with the left-wing faction. The treatment of, I confess that I have not read much of Master and Commander, so I can't comment on that. Can I make a confession? I'm a Napoleonic historian. in my spare time, the last thing I do is read stuff about Napoleon or French history. I personally like noir detective stories. I like detective stories set in the 20th century. uh,
You're allowed
particularly,
your leisure reading of choice.
yeah, I mean, if you're an accountant, I don't know if there are any accountants in the audience, but if you're an accountant on the weekend, you're not like, balancing books for fun. I'm not doing French history for fun in my spare time. I love France. I like going there, but not French. I don't study French history in my spare time. Sorry. So I don't know. Are there any notable descendants? No, the answer is no. Well, hold on a minute. Let me take that back. There are no direct descendants of Napoleon from his legitimate official marriages, but Napoleon had lots and lots and lots of affairs and had lots and lots and lots of children out of wedlock by these affairs. And there are, I believe, many descendants of Napoleon from those affairs, but no direct official descendants. Um, the person There is a person who represents the Napoleon line. Uh, it's a guy called Prince Charles. He calls himself Prince Charles Napoleon. He's actually a descendant of one of Napoleon's younger brothers, Jerome. So the crown, such as it, if it existed, uh, ended up going to the descendants of a younger brother of Napoleon, because Napoleon himself he only had one official child in marriage. Josephine, his first wife, could not have children anymore for whatever reason, and so Napoleon had no children with her, and then Napoleon remarried and had only one child, a son. Okay, the Bonaparte clan's republicanism in the American Revolution. Yeah, the American Revolution was a great influence on the French Revolution, and the earliest French Republicans were very, very, very much directly inspired by the American example. However, the republicanism that France actually gets in 1792, 93, and going forward is so different from the republicanism of the American Revolution. French revolutionary republicanism, in particular, is profoundly centralizing. Everything comes from Paris. Everything comes from Paris. There is no latitude, freedom, leeway granted to regions or cities. It's a very top-down kind of rule by fiat from Paris, which has nothing at all to do with American republicanism. American republicanism is very decentralized, especially back then when the states were almost like independent countries and the United States was almost like a confederation of these independent countries. So the answer is not Napoleon. The early Republicans were, but they gradually became disillusioned with that early American republicanism. In fact, the earliest French revolutionary Republicans, the first ones in 1789 to talk about America and put it out as an example, were a guy called Condorcet and a guy called Brissot. They both get their heads chopped off by by Robespierre for being too moderate. So that's the difference. The only connection American and French republicanism has is that both of them reject kings. Both of them refuse to have kings. But beyond that, there really isn't much similarity anymore. let's see. Oh, okay, I think I'm caught up to questions.
Yeah.
No,
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, I'd just like to thank you, Rafe, so much. This was a really fascinating talk, on its own, but for anybody who's seen the movie or is planning to see the movie, it really gives you some insights, something to think about. So much appreciated.
thank you. And if anyone has thinks of a question, or I'm always available by email through my FSU History Department website to talk about Napoleon. Um, uh, I'm a professor at a public university, and I see my role is to be available to the public. So, if any and every question, if you're interested, or if you just want to discuss, I'm happy to do so.
Great, thank you so much.